I see participants are still joining. I'm going to wait just a minute. Apologies for the late start to everybody. We had a little bit of technical difficulty, which seems to be the reality of the Zoom calls these days in our new virtual world we live in. So thank you for your patience. And we have a great number of people joining. So I'm just going to hang on for just another minute as that participant number ticks up, and we'll start in just a minute. Great, it's slowing down, so I'm gonna get us started. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Kate Gordon. I'm the director of the Office of Planning and Research in the Governor's Office here in California. I'm also the chair of the Strategic Growth Council. And I'm just delighted today to be joined by one of my colleagues, as well as a number of leaders from across the state of California, to talk about today, the switch over, again, it happened as of today, July 1st, the switch over in the CEQA process from using level of service or LOS for transportation analysis to using VMT. All of that seems incredibly wonky, so I just wanted to take a minute to say why this is such an important issue for the state and moment for the state. We in California have seen many decades of development patterns that for a lot of good reasons prioritized folks getting very quickly into urban centers to their jobs. It's created a lot of far-flung housing development. It's created some real concerns around building in high fire risk zones and other not particularly resilient areas of the state. And probably most important, it's created a situation where people have been living in housing that appears to be affordable, but then their transportation costs have just eclipsed housing costs, and it's become an unaffordable and untenable situation. On top of all of this, we in California have a set of laws that are very strong laws that require us to meet a set of climate goals and to reduce our overall emissions and have a more climate resilient state. And the more that we drive, the harder it is to reach those goals and to comply with those laws. We are a heavy driving state because of the way we've been built out. Our vehicle miles traveled must come down by approximately 25%, according to our Air Resources Board, along with a 10 times increase in electric vehicles and other types of vehicles if we're going to meet those climate goals. So all of these things together are critically important, and why SB 743 and using vehicle miles traveled as a metric is one critical tool in a toolbox that involves a lot of other tools, but one critical tool in helping reduce how much we drive, giving folks options all over the state for those long, for avoiding those long commutes, emphasizing and prioritizing housing near jobs, near services, and development that allows people much more time with families, communities, and a better quality of life with better health outcomes. I wanted to say before turning it over to my colleagues that, one of the things that I think has worried people about this switch has been this question of whether we'll still be able to do a significant amount of development in California. And what we found in the many years of 7 years leading up to this day is that there are actually over 50% of the developable acres of land in California that remain across the state are actually in areas that are already low VMT and or are within close proximity to transit. So in all those areas, we already have this amazing opportunity with today's switch to streamline CEQA, to reduce development costs, and to prioritize, again, this approach to development that is more sustainable, more resilient, and more inclusive for all Californians. So I'm really excited to talk about that today, to talk about how the state is thinking through this issue from both a land use and a transportation perspective, and also how it's playing out in various diverse regions of the state. With me today, I have Toks Omishakin, who's the director of Caltrans, and he is here with me to talk about what the impacts of this switch will be on our transportation system. We have, and sorry about the technical glitches here. We're working through some looks like we're working through signing back into our PowerPoint. I am here also with, well, I should say, sorry to back up, that Toks I'll introduce more fully when it's time for him to speak, which will be in just a second. I have Ashley Swearengin, who is the president and CEO of the Central Valley Community Foundation. And also, of course, as many of you know, was the mayor of Fresno from 2009 to 2016. And in that role, prioritized a more dense and community-focused development pattern in that city. We have Chanell Fletcher, who's the executive director of ClimatePlan, and 10 years of experience there working on climate change, land use, and transportation intersections. She also has experience before that working with the Safe Routes to School National Partnership and in the Department of Transportation in the federal government. And finally, Seleta Reynolds, who's the general manager of the Los Angeles Department of Transportation, which is the second largest municipal transportation agency in the country. And we should say has been using VMT as a metric for at least a year. So on the ground experience in an extremely diverse city of how this works in reality. So really, really amazing group of people. I'm going to turn it back to my colleague, William Walker, to talk to us for just a minute about how we're going to run the webinar. And William, I know you're having a little bit of, there you go. I was going to say challenge with the slide deck, but why don't you talk us through how we're going to run this and how folks will be able to ask questions when it's time.
All right, thank you very much, Kate. And we apologize for the technical difficulties, and we appreciate everyone for joining us today. And we do understand with all the different things going on in California amidst all the different events and crises, we really appreciate you taking the time to join us. Our overview for our question and answer segment, which will happen after we speak with all of our panelists from throughout the state. We want you to know that we disabled chat. There are more than 600 of you, 800 of you registered. So we wanted to make sure that a lot of times the chat function can be a bit cumbersome. So you have to say that, but you're welcome to ask your questions using the Q&A function. You can do that through Zoom at the very bottom of your screen. Every question that is may not be answered because of the number of participants.
William, you're breaking up.
And lastly,
William, you're breaking up just a little bit.
Have a question that hasn't been answered, you're welcome to send us questions at sb743questions@opr.ca.gov. Very excited about the panelists that we have today, and I will hand it right back to you, Director Gordon.
Thank you so much, William. And you broke up just a little bit there, so I wanted to reiterate that questions will be through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, which is at the very bottom. If you move your cursor down to the bottom, you'll see Q&A down there with two little speech bubbles. That's where we'll be doing questions, and both William and Beth Hotchkiss, who we work with, will be moderating questions and asking them at the end. So thank you so much, William, for all the work you did setting this up, and also to Beth for the work behind the webinar. With that, I'm going to just say a couple words about my colleague Toks, who I'm just thrilled is in his position as Caltrans Director. Toks comes to us after 8 years at the Tennessee Department of Transportation, where he was the Deputy Commissioner for Environment and Planning. Toks has a long history of working on multimodal and environmental planning processes in a state that is complicated. A lot of rural areas, a lot of really diverse areas. And one where you might not immediately think, multimodal bike lanes are the #1 priority. And so Toks has a deep experience doing this work on the ground in a deeply practical way. And we're just thrilled he's here. And I'm going to turn it over to him to talk about the implications of this shift on Caltrans and how he's thinking about that. Toks?
Thank you, Kate, thank you for that introduction. And I'll start off by just saying about Kate, the partnership that we've had so far in just only 9 months of me being here has been very meaningful on this effort and several others. So thank you for that, and thank you for pulling us together on this webinar to talk about this very important issue. And thank you to your team, your senior team. I see Chris is on, and William, everyone that's worked hard to pull this together. Thank you for that. And to our partners as well, Seleta, Ashley, and Chanell. I think I've had a chance to meet Chanell before in a meeting here at Caltrans, but I've had a chance to talk to Seleta and Ashley, thank you for the partnership and the work you're doing both on the NGO side and the local government side on this work. And to the Caltrans team as well, Ellen Greenberg has been our leader on 743 for many years. And since I've been here, and Jeannie Wardwaller has also been helping us to move the ball across the finish line as we get here on a day like today. So thank you for all the work that you've done as well. So it's a momentous day. It's July 1st. Many people in the department today have said to me, Happy New Year. And I was looking at them like they were crazy, but Happy New Year, because on our end at Caltrans, if you get any federal money, you know that it's a new fiscal year. A new fiscal year starts today, but it also happens to be the day as we meet here, as Kate mentioned, that we officially start implementing SB 743. But why is this so important? I mean, why is it important for us to head down this road? I think, as has been stated already, we know that there are multiple, impacts that this has, when we make a focus to go in a direction that we're talking about going in. So from a climate air standpoint, from an environmental standpoint across the board, an economic standpoint, when it comes to issues of the social fabric of our community, making a decision to say, look, this is a direction that we want to go in related to what SB 743 is about, is something that we know we have to be fully behind. Ultimately, what we want to do is reduce the dependence on having to drive everywhere. When you think about our state so far, we have over 500,000 people in the state of California that we consider super commuters, that are driving, that are spending more than 3 hours a day in their cars, 90 minutes one direction commuting to work or a destination. That's way too many people. And there are some people right under that threshold. So we know we have to make changes as it relates to how people get about the state and create more multimodal opportunities for people. From a Caltrans standpoint, this is very much in alignment with many of the plans that we've laid out, the direction that we want to head, and obviously where the administration wants to head as well. Our long-range plan, CTP 2050, is very much in connection with a lot of the tenets of SB 743. Our strategic plan that we're laying out, our strategic plan is different from the 2050 plan. The 2050 plan is more about our long-range goals for transportation. But the strategic plan for the department itself, the goals, the visions, the values that we're going to set forth are very much in alignment with the things that we want to all achieve through SB 743. So how do we get there? What are the tools that we're going to use from the Caltrans end to actually implement the goals of SB 743? The CEQA review process is clearly number one. The projects that are on the state highway system, we're going to use the CEQA review guidelines or CEQA review process to make sure that the projects that are coming on the state highway system are very much in alignment with the tenets of SB 743. And then our local development review process for when local development is happening across the state. We'll use our authority there, our ability there to also review local development as it happens. And many of you have been involved in providing comments throughout the way on both of those fronts, on those tools that we will be using. So thank you to all local partners, local entities who have been providing us comments on this as well. But so, the outlook for SB 743 in our state, like I said, I think it's great as far as issues related to air quality, economic development, the social fabric, the health fabric of the state. But I think I'll be remiss if I didn't say that there are also challenges that we need to be very mindful of. And I will tell you that everybody on the panel, Kate, and our local and NGO partners will tell you these are challenges as well. And we can't be overly myopic about thinking this is going to be an absolute slam dunk in every area. We know we're going to have some kinks to work out along the way, and we're going to be attentive to those kinks that need to be worked out. But one, for example, no doubt, is along the lines of making sure that this is something that is very equitable in the way we go about implementing it. I think people across the state are more aware than ever before, and across the country and the world, as a matter of fact, that equity issues need to be front and center in everything that we do. That our work needs to happen through an equity lens. And we will be making sure that that happens in this case with SB 743. But when you think about implementing this law, implementing this 7-year-old law, we need to make sure that affordable housing and multimodal transportation choices are at the center of it as we go about moving it forward. As we focus on developing in places that already have significant development, as we focus on the types of transportation projects we're going to do moving forward, all those things need to be done through a lens of equity. And oftentimes, I think we all know on this webinar, on this meeting, when we reinvest in existing communities, when we do infill projects, or we put in wider sidewalks or bike lanes in existing communities, often what sometimes happens is there's displacement, there's gentrification. And we want to make sure, and we will be making sure that we have the proper tools in place, that as we do more infill development, as we provide more multimodal transportation choices for existing communities and not necessarily greenfields, that we are making sure that the people who live in those communities, who have been a part of those communities for many years, and they're part of the fabric of that community, that they do not get displaced and get moved out of those communities. Another one of the challenges, the second one that I'll touch on, and I'll wrap up and hand over to Kate and the rest of the team, is the fact that we know we have 25 counties in the state that are what we call self-help counties that have been able to generate sales tax measures to generate revenue for transportation projects. And whether they be managed lane projects or general purpose lane projects, we know that there will be impacts from those projects. We will have to review those projects to make sure that they continue to support and meet the tenets of the law. And look, it's not our goal in any way, I think I've said this before, to try to kill any one of those transportation projects, but we will have to review those projects, and where necessary, push forward on mitigation where needed in many cases. So we will continue to work with all of our partners in those 25 counties that are self-help counties, because one thing that we know for sure is that if we just continue down the path that we've been on for many years, 50, 60 years of just building roads, we continue to create a larger and bigger backlog of projects that Caltrans has to maintain. Anytime, any one of our counties builds another, general purpose lane or another lane on the highway system, those roads, they get turned over to Caltrans, to the state, and we end up having to maintain that system, maintain those roads. And if you think about SB1, which was just 3 years ago, SB1 was probably it's not probably, I know for sure, it's the biggest measure taken by any state in the country for the transportation network, the state transportation network. But it was only, as good as it was, as great as SB1 was, it's only half. There's only half of what we needed to actually maintain the system that we have. So we generated we're going to generate $54 billion over 10 years, whereas the need for the state is over $90 million. It's like 92 or $93 million in maintenance needs over a 10-year period. So our path forward can't be to continue to build out and grow, a wider and bigger system, because we're just adding to that backlog of a system that we need to maintain. We have to be smarter. We have to think about where people live and where people work. And the system that we build should be inclusive of technology, opportunities to use technology to get the best out of the system, to optimize the system, and multimodal choices for people to be able to commute about the state. So I want everybody to know that we are absolutely committed to the goals of SB1, and we are going to maintain a fix-it-first approach to getting the work done that we need to get done. The voters supported SB1, even though there was an effort to repeal it, and we're completely behind making sure that we meet the goals of SB1, and also the efforts that have been laid out in SB 743. I look forward to the continued partnership with Kate and her team and our local and nonprofit partners as well. So Kate, thank you very much for allowing Caltrans to have a voice in this conversation and organizing the discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Toks. That was incredibly helpful overview, and I'm particularly glad that you touched on the equity issues that are really central to this conversation, not only because of the need to continue thinking about the potential of gentrification and displacement as we focus on infill development, but also the importance of not continuing patterns of redlining and other patterns that have been part of the history of planning in this state in many places. Also really glad you touched on the state's interest in the overall highway system, and our interest on the land use side in the overall health and quality of life and impacts of development on the state, whether it's from a climate impact perspective, a health and safety perspective, or an inclusive and equitable development perspective. So the state perspective, you've heard, we're going to turn to those who are actually making this happen on the ground. And I'm going to just ask one quick question to each of you at the outset, and then I have a couple of more specific questions, and we are still going to save time at the end for Q&A because it is really important from the audience, and we want to hear from you to the extent we can. But let me just start with this question, and I'm going to go from the south to north, starting with Seleta, then Ashley, and then Chanell. But really the question is, you've heard me and Toks, and we've all talked many times about why it's important to think about a new development pattern, or sort of move away from something that's been part of California development for about 70 years or more, which is a very highway focused development pattern. What does that move look like in your region? And you have a very diverse region, but what does it look like down there? What does an alternative look like, and how are you moving in that direction?
Sure. So I'll start by just saying I've been in transportation for a little over 22 years now, on the public and private side, most of that in California, either as a consultant doing EIRs and doing traffic studies, or on the city side and sort of reviewing them, setting thresholds and overseeing them, or implementing transportation projects and really trying to execute infrastructure projects in cities like San Francisco and Oakland and Los Angeles. And Los Angeles is such a large place. It really contains every type of land use pattern. There's parts of the city where my biggest concern is equestrian crossings, all the way to Koreatown, which is one of the densest neighborhoods west of the Mississippi, and second only to Manhattan in its density. And so for us, we need a tool that is more context sensitive and more enables us and empowers us to set mitigation measures that match up more appropriately with that wide variety of contexts that we have in the city. And the thing that we were seeing with level of service is it's a really blunt tool, and you're applying very suburban kind of trip rates and analysis methods to very urban areas. And so what that transition looks like, first of all, it looks like transportation and land use being more integrated and working more as one. It also looks like a much more mindful and intentional approach to issues like displacement. As we build out one of the largest restorations of subway and light rail in North America, if not the world, we know that even though transit does not cause gentrification and displacement, it is a really powerful predictor of where that will be concentrated if we do not build adequate housing. And so we needed to figure out a way to make building housing and adequate housing and affordable housing balanced with land use and jobs in city centers, something that was more viable and something that was easier to do, and also get the transportation projects that make it more comfortable and safer and easier for people to, not own a car basically, or maybe not own a second car, maybe not, this is Los Angeles, maybe not own a fourth car, have access to things like car sharing, transit, biking, walking, frequent affordable choices that allow people to live the lives that they want to live, and that enable people to be able to live closer to where they work.
Thanks so much, Seleta. And I'm really glad you brought in something I know you've done a lot of work on, which is the sort of new technologies in transportation and how they're shaping and changing the way that we think about what's possible in terms of mode shifting and options for folks. Ashley, I'm going to go to you on this question. So, particularly in the Central Valley, where Highway 5 is so central, and we've just really seen a lot of development around highways. How does it look to move in a new direction? What do you think a kind of a vehicle miles traveled approach looks like in the region that you live in?
Well, so that is a really, really big question, and one that we've been wrestling with in Fresno for at least the last 10 years. And so first, let me just say thank you for inviting somebody from the Central Valley to be a part of this conversation. I think so often we feel like the other California, and we actually get to the point of this particular legislation, our experience is very different. And yet we're here today looking at how this can positively impact our community. So I think probably it's helpful just to give you some context. And I was looking through the participant list, I see maybe a small handful of people who I recognize as being from Fresno, but I'm guessing a lot of folks are more from the coastal congested areas. So I want you to just take a moment to go on a little mind journey with me and imagine what life is like in the Central Valley. So I'm going to give you some context. And I wrote down some notes. I know we want to be more conversational today, but I also want to cover a lot. So let me just kind of get through this pretty quickly. So first of all, let me again say my comments are entirely based on my perspective from Fresno and the Central Valley and doing community and economic development work here for the last 20 years. I don't pretend to be an expert on what it's like to manage these tough issues in coastal California. So just keep that in mind. But the view from here, so first of all, some context about Fresno. We're the 5th largest city in California. There are 550,000 people who live in the city. There are 1 million people who live in Fresno County. The city limit itself is 115 square miles. So it's a large physical area. In fact, the sphere of influence in the city of Fresno is 157 square miles. Our current density, get this, you coastal people, hang on for a second. Our current density in the city of Fresno is 1.9 units per acre. Yeah, I saw the silent wow on Kate Gordon's face just now as she's mutedly responded, 1.9 units per acre. The first 50 years of the city's history, the city grew to be about 10 square miles. So imagine 50 years, 10 square miles. Here comes World War II. Here comes what impacted every major American city, the post-World War II area. In the next 65 years, Fresno went from a 10 square mile city to 115 square miles. So a factor of 10 in terms of land mass accumulated and expansion of this city, all right? In that process, 60,000 acres of farmland were taken out of commission just by the city of Fresno alone. And keep in mind that this development pattern is very common in the Central Valley along Highway 99. There are 62 other cities in the Central Valley, not as large as Fresno, but that have done similar things with their land use pattern. It's more the norm than the exception. So if you stop to calculate the amount of agricultural acres that have been taken out of production in the Central Valley, it is by far the greatest threat to food production and our nation's food supply. So this is a really significant issue. So during the period of time, the last 60 years, what our economy has looked like, our base economy, as I said, has been mostly production agriculture. Now that's an industry that feeds the world. It is vitally important to our nation and to the entire human race. We hold a significant role in the entire world. We feed the world, but this industry does not feed the residents of the Central Valley. So what that means is we've got to find a way to accommodate production ag, feed the world, but also diversify our economy. And this is just something that we have completely missed over the last 50 or 60 years, and we're now aggressively trying to make up for. But as a result of that lack of economic diversification, what happened is that in Fresno, home building within the city limits became really the primary economic activity. All right, that means that as long as land is cheap and financing is available, home builders are building homes, and it really becomes an illusion of economic growth. So a city economy that's driven almost exclusively by suburban development alone is a cotton candy economy. It tastes good at first, but it quickly melts away. It has no lasting nutritional value. As long as you're leapfrogging in this kind of an economy, you can keep up the illusion that maybe you're growing the economy and improving the prosperity of the residents in your community. But if something breaks that cycle of new development, you find out the real truth. Well, that happened for us in Fresno with the foreclosure crisis and the Great Recession. That broke the cycle of new development, and it revealed a very broken city that had been broken for a long time. So today, the current conditions on the ground, this is today in Fresno, 72% of the census tracts in the city of Fresno are low opportunity neighborhoods. 72%. Just imagine the community that you're in right now, and imagine the physical map on the wall of your community, and then take almost 3/4 of the city and imagine that every census tract and every person living in those census tracts are at or below the poverty level, that there is a lack of home ownership, and that there are very significant and severe health conditions. And that's how we arrive at the conclusion that these are low opportunity neighborhoods. And it's UC Davis's Regional Opportunity Index that I'm quoting. I should also mention that the dividing line between those 72% of the neighborhoods that are low opportunity and the small fraction that are high opportunity neighborhoods breaks almost entirely along racial lines in Fresno. So, a long-winded answer to your question, Kate, are we thinking about doing something different in Fresno? The answer is hell yes. Hell yes. Our current pattern is not sustainable, and it is not good for the current shareholders of the city of Fresno, property owners, residents, et cetera, small business owners. So something definitely needs to change. I don't think anybody in our community thinks that 743 is a silver bullet, but it is a tool. I think one other thing that's important to put on the table, especially as we have a statewide audience today, is as I've done community and economic development in Fresno and the Central Valley for the last 20 years, just want to call this out. There's a huge stigma and a bias on coastal California as it relates to inland California. There's a bias against our schools. There's a bias against our universities. There's a bias against the people who live here. And so when we want to raise questions like, why are you guys packing in all those jobs in a crazy way and making people drive 3 hours to get there? Don't you know there are other parts of California that can sustainably accommodate job creation activities, and we already have the housing to support it? What I've heard literally to my face is, oh no, we could never go there. Your people aren't smart enough to do the work that we need them to do. So let me just put that on the table and say, California, it's time to let that go and change your perception of what's happening in inland California, because our entire state, frankly, depends on our ability to get this balance right. And that means moving jobs to where housing is, and then also correcting the imbalance in coastal California with housing. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Ashley. That was a lot on the table, but I just want to say thank you so much for raising a couple of really key issues. One, and you made this point about the Central Valley, but just a data-driven point here, Bakersfield and Sacramento are the fastest growing cities in California. they are not on the coasts. So we really do have enormous growth happening in the central part of the state. And so how that growth happens is particularly important. To your really important point about farmland conversion, so thank you for raising that. That is something that I think sometimes when we think about infill and development and VMT reduction, we forget about the other side of the coin, which is land preservation. And that's land that's currently working land for forests and farms. Also natural land that can serve as really critical, you know, flood reduction, fire breaks, just the land in California serves an incredibly important function. And I love cotton candy economy. I'm stealing that and using it. I'm going to go to Chanell up in the northern part of the state and really ask you the same sort of, what does it look like? What does growth look like going forward? How is 743 part of that puzzle?
Thank you, Kate. And I just want to say also thank you, I think, to Kate and the entire OPR team and to Caltrans for having me here. Very excited to talk about this. And I know that, you know, Melanie Curry at Streets Blog actually just wrote an article that just came out today, so I'm happy to share with other folks as well. But I know that both Seleta and Ashley talked a lot about Fresno and Los Angeles. And so I would say that first and foremost in Northern California, you know, like Oakland, San Jose, San Francisco, a lot of them have already implemented 743. And so I think on our end and for ClimatePlan, we've been involved in this law since honestly 2013 when it passed, and we've been pushing for it and supporting for it. And so I have a lot of gratitude to San Francisco and Oakland and San Jose and other folks that have already kind of done that implementation. One of the things that we've been the most concerned about, actually, I would say up in Northern California, has been the efforts around resegregation that's happening here in the Bay Area. And for folks that don't know what's happening, I'll do a little bit of just like urban planning 101 in terms of talking about the impacts of redlining and racism and how our communities were even created. And so I think this is what's really important, I think, to drive home that point, is that what we have seen is a lot of the communities that were built and were built out, a lot of these suburbs were built out as a way of white flight. And so basically what it was is that wealthier white people did not want to live with people who looked like me. We built out these highway systems to create basically a way for you to drive past these cities, to live in these suburbs, whereas like people that look like me, Black people, through like redlining and racial covenants, were forced to live in communities in the inner city. And so we created this dichotomy. And what we're seeing now actually builds on that, which is now it's the reverse that's happening. And we're seeing a lot of whiter, wealthier communities moving into the cities. So you're looking at Oakland, you're looking at San Francisco, you're looking at the price of homes in these communities, and it is skyrocketing. It is unaffordable. I can't even afford to buy a home where I live in Alameda. And what's happening is that a lot of community, like a lot of lower income communities of color, Black communities, brown communities, are being pushed out into places, Antioch, Oakley, Manteca, Merced. We're being pushed out further and further because that's where we can afford homes. And I bring up this point because what 743 has the potential to start, and I think I want to be clear that 743 is not going to be a panacea for everything. It's not going to fix our housing policies. It's not going to fix the efforts surrounding segregation. But what it can start to do is it can start to look at where we're growing and how we're growing. And it can start to think about how do we make it easier to build infill, which has been challenging for a lot of reasons. 743 can start to look at how are we reducing how much we're driving? How are we investing in other modes of transportation? And in a lot of ways, how are we not adding capacity to freeways to address things like congestion, but how are we honestly thinking about where people are going, how are they getting to jobs, how are they getting to communities? I've seen some questions already in the Q&A, things that we do need to think about: displacement, gentrification. I mean, the way that you address that is honestly through tenant protections, just eviction, rent control. I mean, that's what we need to see in tandem with 743 as it's being implemented. We need to think about ways that we make it easier to build affordable housing and make it cheaper. Those are some of the things that also need to happen in addition to 743, and which is why I think I kind of continually come back to that point that 743 is going to make it easier to build in existing communities. It's going to make it easier that sprawl isn't the only option for lower income communities or communities of color, but we can't just rely on 743. We really do need to think about holistically, how are we addressing housing and who we're building that housing for, and making sure that we have all of the policy and all of the tools in the toolbox to do that work. The other final point that I'll just very quickly make is that I think one of the most beautiful things that I've seen about 743 and its implementation now has been what Caltrans is doing. And so I think thank you to Toks and Jeannie and Ellen, because part of what they're doing is they're creating a process where we as advocates are working with, inland communities and rural communities to think through some of the issues that are coming up. And I think that that's an important point that, with 743, a lot of things are speculation. We don't know the impacts because honestly, we've never done this. And the more that we can work together, the more that we can create those processes, have these conversations together as a group to figure out how do we do this? How do we move this forward? Instead of kind of efforts around delay, I think the better California is going to be, the more we're going to see the kind of California that we want. And I think all of us want, which is a more sustainable and equitable California. Thank you, Kate.
Chanell, thank you. That was a great set of answers, and stay on the video for a second because I'm going to stick with you for just a second. But really appreciate particularly your emphasis on, and all of you have said this in a variety of ways, but that 743 is not the only tool in the toolbox. It's not a silver bullet. It's an important tool to reduce the need to drive, to increase access, to increase affordability, but it's got to be in conjunction with other processes and other tools. And I think that's important. I just wanted to stick with you for a second, Chanell, and say, one of the criticisms that we've heard in the lead up to today, and particularly in the last couple of months, is just this concern that 743 adds a new layer that will potentially make things more expensive, that will go against our desire for affordability. You've obviously really spoken from an equity perspective and an affordability perspective. What do you say to that? What do you say to those concerns or to those criticisms?
I mean, I think the biggest thing I would say is that, I've heard that too. And I think for one thing, the point is that with 743, it adds this mitigation, but that mitigation can be used for affordable housing. So I think part of the challenge for me is that we haven't even had that conversation about mitigation, so we don't even know what 743 is going to do. So instead of saying it's going to add a fee to housing development, we don't know that. We haven't had a conversation about mitigation. So first, we need to actually have the conversation of what the mitigation is and what it can fund. One. Two is that as someone that lives in Alameda, thinking about buying a home, and I'm looking at places like Tracy, the commute that I would have to get to Oakland from Tracy, that in and of itself is going to add to the cost of the cheaper home that is in Tracy. And that's what we're not talking about, is we're not talking about the impact and the burden in terms of the cost, in terms of the time. I have 2 kids, think about that commute in and of itself. So I think, it's easy to say we want to, accumulate wealth for low-income communities and communities of color, and buying a home is obviously a way to do that, but we shouldn't, and I say we because at this point I am looking at buying a home. I shouldn't have to choose between accumulating wealth and living in Tracy and commuting to Oakland. That shouldn't be the option for me and the only option for me to own a home. And I think that's the opposite of what I assume we all would want for low-income communities and communities of color.
That is a great point, and thank you for emphasizing that affordability point, and that affordability is more than the price of the home. It's really a combination of prices. And I would add health costs too is definitely something we've seen in terms of spending all your time on the freeway, driving through a lot of neighborhoods with a lot of air quality issues. These are also contribute to health costs that are part of the affordability conversation as well. I definitely want to leave time for audience questions, so I'm just going to go very quickly to Seleta and say, you've had 743, or not 743, but VMT has been part of your analysis and part of your approach for over a year. In LA. Can you give us any, folks want to see examples of this and what does it actually look like? Can you give us any examples of what this looks like on the ground, and just maybe a project or an approach that you've seen and how it's worked?
Sure. So we've had about 119 projects come through the VMT process since we instituted our VMT calculator. It culminated in several years worth of work, and really the reason why that work was so important is that we wanted to make sure that the thresholds for analysis and the VMT tools that we were going to be using were really tailored for the different parts of Los Angeles, and were context sensitive. We weren't applying a Koreatown trip generation out in the valley. And what we found anecdotally, and it takes a long time to really understand the impacts of all of these things. But first of all, the analyses themselves have gotten a lot simpler and a lot shorter. So instead of having 150 intersections that you have to analyze, and then 30 where you'd have significant impacts, and then 10 where you couldn't mitigate those impacts and you just have to carry findings of overriding consideration and get nothing. Projects will have one VMT impact, and then they'll have the list of mitigation measures that they're going to implement. And we're starting to get really creative and have some good conversations about could we even have a VMT bank where projects in one part of the city can make improvements or contributions to other parts of the city, and in that way have sort of almost like a mini cap and trade, sort of a marketplace. The thing I'll say that we did get some pushback specifically for projects in the Valley who didn't felt like they should have more of a compact infill threshold than a suburban threshold. And so what we did is we looked back at the last 20 projects that came through the old level of service analysis threshold, and we applied the VMT method to those to see what the outcome would have been. Like, let's just compare. Let's look at these projects and see what would have happened. And what we found is that about 5 of them would have just gotten screened out for size because they were too small. About 13 of them had mitigatable impacts that we actually would have gotten some mitigations for instead of just having to make findings of overriding consideration. And then 2 of them would have required a full EIR, but they were such large projects that there is really no way that projects that were the size that they were going to be able to get away without doing a full EIR anyway. So after we did that, we really demystified it for people. So what we're finding is we have a lot less paper. We are getting a lot simpler analyses. We're able to be a lot more creative. And even for some of those projects in the Valley that felt like, hey, we really think we ought to have a trip generation that looks more like an infill development, we were able to work with them and say, okay, fine, we'll do that, but then we'll have a mitigation monitoring program. So you'll need to come back to us each year and demonstrate to us that you're able to stay below that budget. And so you have a lot of engineers and planners that maybe previously were spending all of their time kind of pushing paper around and doing big reports and saying, we either need to narrow sidewalks to provide more travel lanes, or we have to make a finding of overriding consideration. Now they're moving into being more creative and interesting sort of roles where they're doing mitigation monitoring. They're really crafting very creative and interesting mitigation packages that are more in line with what our residents and communities really want to see these projects fund. And it seems to be, at least initially, working actually better for everybody. And after we did that exercise of sort of walking through all those things with the developers in the Valley, they were calmed as well. So once you sort of bring this stuff down and ground truth it, what we're finding is that it actually is working a lot better for everybody all the way around.
Thanks, Seleta. It's always so helpful to hear the actual reality on the ground, because as Chanell said, many folks don't know how this is going to work yet in their areas. And so you've got this great experience actually seeing it work. And I will say that on the analysis side, our discussion with consultants around the state who have been using VMT it's about a fifth of the state right now, has also shown that we're looking at about an 80% reduction in analysis costs going from LOS to VMT, which I think is a really important point. I'm going to go, because I know Ashley's going to get one of these audience questions lobbed to her. I'm going to go straight to the audience questions and ask Beth to ask the first one that has risen up. And I'm going to reserve the right also to maybe go 2 or 3 minutes over the hour. Apologies in advance for those who can stay, but let's get that first question, Beth.
Thank you. So our first question comes from audience member Chris Chu, and he'd love to hear from the speakers on how we might completely change the transportation assumptions for California. COVID has definitely changed our use of roads. They're being closed for pedestrians and bikes, and lanes are being reduced to accommodate outdoor dining. Our transit agencies are also being impacted by the current situation, and a lot of them are suffering. So how do we take this into account and make lasting change given climate change and COVID? And he believes that we can do something big, and he thinks that our population is ready to try something new. Thank you, Chris, for your question.
Great question. Can I get all of the panelists and Toks to put your videos on so that folks can see you? And then really, whoever wants to jump in on this one, how are we rethinking our transportation system in light of COVID and both impacts on transit and impacts on roads? Anyone want to jump in on that? Toks, you want to take a high level on that, or someone else want to jump in?
Sure. I can take a quick stab at that. Very good question, Chris. I mean, from a very high level, I think we are attempting to do that right now. I think as has been said already, 743 is not something that's going to necessarily solve all the challenges that we have across the state, whether it be on the land use side or the transportation side, but it's one tool. But when you think about the examples and the stories that have been shared by my partners on this call, from Seleta to the mayor, and how they're looking at their cities, and Chanell and the work that she's doing across the state, and the work that we're doing at Caltrans with our long-range plan and the priorities that we've laid out, it is not a business as usual approach that we're talking about. I mean, I think we all clearly know the 50-plus year history of the way that we've gone about building the system we have today. But we're at capacity. I mean, the days of, building more giant freeways onto the system, those days are gone. Those days are gone. And so what we have to do is talk about the things that we're putting on the table right now. Everything from how do we optimize the system with technology as much as possible. And look, we know the onset of autonomous vehicles and all those things are coming, but we can't spend all our energy and time focused on autonomous vehicles. But I'm talking about using the existing traffic management systems we have to get the best we can out of the system. Investing in transit more intensively. We're doing that with high-speed rail projects across. We just signed off on the Victorville to Vegas project here at Caltrans and Calsta this week. But I think we're taking a different approach. It may not be communicated in a very holistic way right now. And we probably need to do a better job of communicating that from the state and from the local government level, but it's not a business as usual approach, Chris. I think the outlook is different, no doubt, in the way we need to go about improving the system.
Thanks, Toks. That's a great high-level answer. I know Chanell wanted to jump in on this one real quick.
Very quickly, I think the one thing that I would also say is that Executive Order N1919 has been something that I think we at ClimatePlan, and I know other kind of organizations that we're working with, have been really eager to see California State Transportation Agency and all of you on this kind of like implement and work towards implementation. And I think that's one way that we can really get to the answer to that question of like how to get to that innovation. And I realize that I don't know if everyone knows about Executive Order N1919, so happy to have like Kate or other folks share a little bit about it, but that's something that I think we've been very passionate about.
Yeah, not everybody follows executive orders as closely as you do, Chanell. I know it's shocking. At a very high level, asks us at the agency level to incorporate our climate goals into all of our planning, particularly where we own assets, as in the transportation system and our own real estate system and fleet. But happy to talk. We'll do a whole other webinar on EO 1919. We're almost out of time. I do want to give William a chance to ask one more question, and I know, Ashley, we're looking to you maybe as the first answerer on this one.
All right. When the questioner asks, when is the state going to stop this trend of super commuting by requiring the major urbanized areas that have a lopsided jobs housing balance to provide housing for their workforce, rather than destroying farmable land 100 miles away by shifting the housing to agricultural areas? And wanted to thank Bruce Abernathy for that question.
Ashley, that one goes to you, I think. And thanks for those able to stay on the phone, the 576 of you still on. Go ahead, Ashley.
Well, and obviously I can't answer that for the state, but I'll just tell you from a local government perspective, the types of tools and strategies that we've put in place in Fresno to try to do everything possible to make it easy to build where we want to see housing and development happen, and then to really hold firm on our urban boundaries. So just taking the case of our downtown, for example, actually across the city, we went through a, probably 6-year community-driven planning process that resulted in a comprehensive general plan update, a rewriting of a 65-year-old development code that literally made it illegal to do every single thing that we said as a community. We're like, we want downtown, we want all our neighborhoods to be maintained. And then like we wrote into city code, like, make sure you kill your downtown and make sure you really devastate your city. Obviously I'm overstating, but like that was the effect of these local policies that we had on the books. So we rewrote that. We rezoned our entire city in one fell swoop on actually in February of 2016. Not one person was there in opposition. We rezoned an entire city, every parcel, to be consistent with the development code and with the general plan. And the reason why we were able to get that through is because we had done so much work on the ground to really engage residents in this community-driven planning process. Our new zoning code has by right in every zone district, so no more CUPs needed if you're building according to plan. So I'm saying all of that to say, we have pulled the policy lever and the regulatory lever as hard as we can to support the type of growth that we want. And there are pressures outside of our own city that come hard in the face of the change we're trying to make. And so it is the case that regional and statewide issues have to be addressed as well.
Thank you, Ashley. And a really important point that you made, and sadly we'll have to end on that, but a really important point you just made about stakeholder engagement from the very beginning and why that's so critical and important to making these processes not only work, but also be as inclusive and as equitable as possible. So thank you for that point. I wish we could be on this webinar for another hour because there are a lot of great questions and these folks are so smart and so great to have them captive here on my screen. But sadly, we have to let them go and all of you go. Thank you to everyone for joining us. Thank you to our teams at Caltrans and OPR who have done work for years to make this day happen. And thank you to everyone who's going to be working to implement it, which is, as we all know, the hard work starts with implementation and making sure that this works in a way that, as Toks said at the very beginning, is sustainable and equitable and does, move us toward a more inclusive California for all. So thanks all of you, Ashley, Chanell, Seleta, thanks to Toks and to all of our teams for everything. And we look forward to talking to all of you many times in the future about these issues. Thank you.